Welcome to A Better Me, A Better You, A Better Us podcast series at the School of Dentistry here at the University of Leeds. I'm Tamora Shemwood and I'm the School Academic Lead for Inclusive Pedagogies, aka the SALIP, and I'll be your host today. Again, I'm lucky enough to be joined by Dr. Simon Fleming, internationally renowned culture change advocate, and Leeds alumni Shivam Kotecha. Together we'll be exploring the journeys of Simon and Shivam, which have led them to have such impact on cultural change. Simon, Shivam, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, I think it's fair to say that both of you at quite different points in your career. Shivam, you graduated from Leeds in 2022, and you're currently completing your dental foundation year. And Simon, you're a little further on in your day job as orthopaedic surgeon and in your medical education, and as your culture change advocate. But what I'm really interested in finding out is what was the catalyst that it was that started both of you on this journey for pushing for cultural change.
So, for me, a large part of it was arriving at university, having had a life before uni that was very difficult to describe it, but I went to a private school when I was younger, and I was there until I was 18, and I was surrounded by people who were like me, who had the same kind of upbringing as me, culturally the same as me. You know, there were slight variations within our year group, but majority of people were pretty much, you know, of the same way of thinking and that kind of thing. And arrived at Leeds, and obviously we entered into a year group that was a real kind of mix of people from different cultures and backgrounds and countries, and I was fascinated by the culture that was kind of I was entering into here, and that was what really got me to start thinking about culture in terms of something that I'd never really addressed in my head, that culture is actually a thing. It just was.
Yeah.
Being in the kind of same environment all the time and not really experiencing a different culture, you kind of just think that, well, that's just life. There's not different cultures that exist in different environments.
Yeah.
And for me, that was the catalyst of thinking, wow, there is a different culture out here, and some of the things are great because they really align with what I think. Some of the aspects of the culture are making me change my way of looking at things, and some of the things I potentially didn't agree with, even after giving consideration to aspects of that culture. And that was really kind of the motivation on my journey for thinking about cultural change on a very kind of small level, just within myself. Before then, obviously, the rest of the journey began as we kind of spoke about in our conference earlier.
So it was the realisation that maybe you had been locked in an echo chamber for a little while.
Yeah, precisely.
So much so that it led you to think that there was no such thing as culture.
Yeah, it just was.
Interesting.
That was it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I alluded to it earlier. My sister and I reflect on this a lot because obviously I do what I do, and she runs an LGBTQ charity, and so we're both in similar but different spaces in terms of whatever you want to call it, creative disruption or advocacy or allyship or what have you. I mean, we grew up in a household where some people would call us first generation immigrants, some people second. It depends how you define it, right? But basically, my dad was a Holocaust survivor, and my mum's parents were immigrants, and Dad was a hardworking GP. He was hardly around single practice, yada yada yada. But when he would talk about his upbringing, it was a lot of kind of framed through the lens of his generation, so it is slightly paternalistic and slightly that sort of thing. But he was like, it's the job of people with power to protect people without power, which is a little bit paternalistic and white knighty. But from his point of view, he was like, when I grew up and these awful things were happening, people just watched them happen, and they just said, well, at least it's not us, or well, these things happen. And so both of us have come into this kind of having been quite unconsciously, subconsciously brought up in an idea around the thing with privilege is you can use it for good or evil or not at all, right? And I went to medical school, and I hadn't really fit in at private school. I was kind of the odd one out because I liked books and I didn't really play sports and whatever. And then I went to medical school and I found my tribe, which was kind of slightly nerdy, but enjoyed going out, which at school was not a thing, right? But at medical school and dental school, nerdy but enjoy going out is the thing. Yeah. But then I became a rugby boy, which was interesting because on one hand, I didn't quite fit in with the rugby club. And on the other hand, I was complicit or part of some behaviours which I look on now with undeniable shame. Undeniable, like... oh my God. And my wife and I have spoken about it, like, what would you do if someone said, what did you do at medical school? And actually, I've had people say that to me. I've had people reach out to me on social media and go, you're a hypocrite because of how you behaved at medical school. And I say, I don't think I am. I think I behaved unacceptably. I've openly said that I'm pretty ashamed of some of those behaviours. And I've said that if you'd like to talk about them, we can. And if you feel that... you want to speak to someone more about that, you feel that those behaviours are still going towards harm towards the professional patients now, 614-7740, the gyms here based in Euston, and you need to tell people, because that's you live by the sword, you die by the sword. But for me, it was started at medical school, which was those moments where I didn't feel good, and I couldn't put my finger on it. And at the time, I thought it was just like me at school. I was like, "Oh, you don't fit in." That's why that joke doesn't land well. That's why that song doesn't feel right. Is it's you. And then as I grew up a bit more, saw a bit more of the world, saw a bit more of other cultures, other ways of thinking, I was like, no, I don't think it is me. I think those behaviours are actually just fundamentally not okay. And I didn't feel. And I'd been involved in advocacy in different flavours at an undergrad level, at a foundation year level. But I didn't feel psychologically safe to really speak up or out, really, until I started my orthopaedic training. And unashamedly, it was because when I had done so previously, and I have memories of doing it during my core surgical training, during my foundation training, the only real outcome was me being put up against a wall and being told, you need to shut up, or else. And you're like, yeah, but everyone's got my back, right? And you look behind you and everyone else is like looking at their feet. And you're like, oh, no, just me then, cool. And so again, as I became more and more aware of the things that maybe were okay and weren't okay, and also of the privilege I had that I even felt I could speak up, even though the result was not always great, it kind of built to a head. And it was why I started this work with gusto, kind of 2014, 15.
Yeah.
But everyone's like, yeah, I remember you at medical school. You would always be the one who'd be like, come on, guys. It's kind of a dick move. It's just that everyone would laugh at you and ignore you. And you're like, oh, right. But that was me trying. And they're like, yeah, it didn't work. I'm like, oh, I know it didn't work. But it's a very similar journey of the more aware you become of the wider world and your own privilege, the more you're like, oh, right, this isn't good. This isn't right. And maybe it's not just me that thinks this, which is, of course, how all these systems work. The systems rely on all of us thinking that it's just us, that we're the problem. Because the moment you get a bunch of people who think like that into a room, they go, hey, racism's pretty rubbish, right? Yeah. Is there a lot of racism where you are? Yeah. Oh, me too. I think it's everywhere. Yeah. Oh, right. And that's why those systems try and convince you that it is just you, or that it's not as big a deal as you think it is. Because that's how change comes about, is when you get people in a room going, what's your lived experience like? This. Oh, me too. Yeah, that's not cool.
I think that's actually really interesting, particularly your what you were just saying about racism, and I can really relate to kind of both of your experiences here, because listening to Shivam of the idea of getting a culture shock by moving out of culture into, you know, a more diverse culture. I'll be honest enough to say that until I think I was 16, I thought racism was something that was, you know, from the olden days. I'd managed through just the privilege of where I grew up and, you know, going to a very middle class school and all of those kind of things. It wasn't until I went to FE college that I'd ever heard anyone use a racist slur. I thought racism was something that was from the past.
That was, for me as well, in the kind of environment that I grew up in, until I essentially left school. I hadn't personally ever encountered a racial slur towards me. And I think that was... And I hadn't heard really people, you know... I was in kind of the similar kind of mindset that, you know, this thing's dying out. It's not really
this
a thing.
This is a problem of the old.
Yeah, it's a problem of the old. And then having that kind of culture shock into a more diverse, unsheltered community and culture, you can then see that it very much still is something that exists today, rather than it being something that's almost extinct.
Yeah. And the more you become aware of it, the more you have to do the kind of really hard bit of advocacy, which is listening, which is kind of sitting down and shutting up and going, tell me more about that. So when, you know, I remember being at med school even and having one of my friends go, yeah, like, all of this is just super racist. And my instant knee-jerk reaction was to go, like, no, it's not. I've not seen anything. I've not heard anything. And I remember I vividly going like, how? And they were like, really? You want to know? And I was like, yeah. And they sat down and they explained to me what I now know is differential attainment. Like, hey, have you noticed how you always get asked to go to theatre and I don't? And I was like, no. They're like, well, that's what happens. And you're like, yeah, it is, I guess, right? Like, you just... And that kind of active listening phase of advocacy is hard, because you have to, A, go out there and expose yourself to these different groups, and then B, basically just go, I'm going to sit at the back of the room. And not be on the spotlight, not be on the stage. Because it's so easy to just be like, I don't see it. It's never happened to me. No one I know has it happen to them either. So I guess it must not happen. And then you go out there and you meet diverse groups and you listen to them and you're like, this is happening right now. All of these behaviours are happening right now, but because they don't happen around me, near me, to people I know, I've just assumed they don't. I am... My wife is from the north of England, from a small village where there's like 30 houses, a goat and a pub. Like, that's it, right? And she moved to London, and we were talking about my experiences as a Jewish person, right? Caucasian, middle class, whatever. But I was like, it's a thing. And she was like, oh, okay, fine, yeah. And then I think like our third or fourth date in London, we were in a black cab, and out of the blue, the cab driver just starts in on Yids and Jews and the problem with Jews and blah, blah, blah. And my now wife was like, what's he talking about? And I was like, me, he's talking about me. And he was like, oh, yeah, I hear you. I'm talking about you. I bet you're going to try not to pay you. And like, we were just in the cab. I'd not said anything. I'd not done anything. And we got out the cab, and he basically tried to charge me extra. He was like, it was a whole thing. And afterwards, Kate was like, that just like happened. And I was like, yeah, it just happens. And she's like, is that what people talk about when they're just like, a racism happens? And I'm like, well, that's an extreme example, because, you know, there's also differential attainment and there's all the other stuff. But like that stuff, she was like, I am, whatever age she was, because she'll kill me if I say. She was like, I can't I can't comprehend, I can't conceptualize that someone just on a Tuesday would start saying those things. And I'm like, yeah, now, imagine me trying to explain that to someone. They'd be like, I don't get it, but what did you say? What did you do? How did you provoke that behaviour? And you're like, I existed in the world.
Yeah.
And when I have friends who are people of colour or from the LGBT community, and they're trying to explain what it's like when they experience both the extremes of abuse, but also the subtle, the nuances, the microaggressions, the not being invited to the team event or whatever, you really do have to actively listen, because otherwise it just sounds like I don't get it. Why didn't they invite you? Well, they never invite me. Why? Shut up. It's not about why. It's because they never invite me. Yeah. And let me explain what that feels like.
I think that's really the start of the journey to becoming an advocate. And I mean, before this Better Me, You, Us initiative started, I hadn't really heard of even the term advocate. I didn't know what it was, but I think it was something that I'd kind of stumbled across without actually knowing what it was.
Yeah.
I didn't go out, doing things that I did during dental school to, I want to become an advocate and change this and change that. It was just something that was more, it happened coincidentally as I was entering different roles and going through the kind of progression of becoming a first year who's new to this environment, to then actually being more of a working part of the dental school in terms of not just, doing my clinics and things like that, but a working part of the actual community in terms of, actually giving back to what the community has given to me.
You got buy-in, right? You got skin in the game.
Exactly. So the community isn't just something that you join and that's it. It's, once you join it, you become the community, don't you? So whatever kind of you do on a day-to-day basis, you are the community that's around you, and that's really what kind of started off and has potentially triggered off this whole journey of, culture change and that kind of thing.
That's really an authentic response, though, because I think you introduced me as a culture change advocate or something, and what's interesting is there seems to be two kinds of people. I, like you, didn't go out of my way to do this. It just seemed like what should be done. And the flip side is, it's also now become a badge that people wear, right? You see the pin badge, I'm an advocate, and you get this kind of performative, virtue signalling, humble braggy. Yeah. Today I helped 3 people of colour, so and like scout badges sort of thing, and you're like, oh my god, but people do it for a performative reason, and actually, more commonly, the people who do it and do it well are like, well, it just sort of seemed like the right thing to do, so I did it. Yeah. And then I realised I wasn't doing it very well. So I did a bit of reading or a bit of listening, and then I did it like this, and then I kind of cocked it up. So I changed again, and now I do this, and I live my values, and I amplify who I can, I do what I can, and sometimes I get it wrong. But it's just who I am on a day-to-day basis. Whereas the people who put on their, like, advocate lanyard, and then they go home and are not, that's the red flag for me. Is like, oh, I'm an advocate Monday, Thursdays, and alternate Fridays. No, that's not really a thing. It's either something that you do every day and you choose to do every day, or not. And that kind of authentic, I found myself in this community and felt like I could do more and do more right. That to me feels like a better way.
Yeah.
So, from both of your experiences, you we've already said that you're in different places, but you've both had successes, and I'm going to take a good guess that you've also both had some things that haven't worked. So when your kind of attempts to change culture, be an ally, be an advocate, have worked, is there anything that you can pinpoint that that has contributed to when it works, and also things that contribute to those times when it hasn't.
You want to go? I'll be so. This isn't necessarily a time where I've kind of decided I want to be an ally or an advocate or whatever. So becoming DENSOC president and kind of assessing the situation over the last 2 years and thinking, right, you know, there's certain potentially groups of people within the dental school that may feel that they don't fit in this certain situation or don't feel like they're as integrated, whatever. We decided to kind of set up a few more selective events. So the first few that we set up alongside our kind of normal freshers events for the whole dental school was one specifically for the Kuwaiti students who, you know, form a large part of every single year group.
Yeah.
Now, during my first and second year experience, I at times felt that, you know, I'd spoken to every single person in the year group in first year, and by the time I was in second year, I thought definitely I know everyone on a personal-ish level, but there were still some students who were from Kuwait, the international students, that I hadn't actually gotten round to speaking to because I hadn't seen them in social situations or, you know, we come into lectures and if you're not in the same clinic group or whatever, you just wouldn't actually get round to it. So that was one of the things that we focused on, and we hosted a dessert and coffee morning, and I think there's maybe around 20 students from Kuwait in every single year group. We had about six students attend that, along with some of us as, you know, from the DENSOC committee, and it was such a good morning. We really, really got to know each other and got to have those conversations as to why potentially some students don't feel like they want to come to social situations that might be suitable for them, that kind of thing. And I came back and I felt really good, but then also it was 6 people out of maybe 50 odd that could have attended that. And we kind of went to this dessert parlour in the centre of Leeds and we're like, yeah, we'll bring loads of people, like open up a little bit early for us. We had the whole place to ourselves, and then ended up being on one
6 of you.
on one table. And we also did a bowling event for our international students, because we have international students that come from Kuwait, and we also have some international students from other parts of the world as well. So we hosted an event specifically for them in order to maybe try and connect these students to other students who have come from other parts of the world, you know, share their experiences. You know, this is what Tesco's like in the UK, you know, that kind of thing, just helping people settle in. We had one person come to that event with a couple of us from the committee. But again, you can look at it and think, is that a failure that just one person attended? We did everything, marketing, and shared it on social media and spoke to people like, yeah, we'll come. And then one person attended. But that one person, ever since, so that was in third year, all throughout university, every time I'd see him in the corridor, we'd stop and chat. And to me then, if I look at that, is that a failure, or is that just that we've reached out and managed to advocate or become an ally to someone, but maybe not has been as successful as we originally thought we would? That was something that was something that I had to get my head round to begin with, because I kind of did reflect on the situation and was like, is what we did, like, we tried it, do we just give up now? And is that it? Like, obviously not many people are that keen for this kind of thing. What happens? And equally, that could have gone the same way today. I mean, we had our
it could have been
we had
right?
our conference today, right? And there could have been 5 people that attended, luckily it wasn't. You know,
No,
we've
Done
done
one of
That's
those.
good.
I did one of those.
Yeah.
I did a talk to an organizer and a cleaning person.
Yeah.
Oh,
So it could have been the same situation. And what would we have measured that as? Would we have said, oh, you know, it's not been a success? You could have said that. But you can also say that it was a success, because even 5 people or 1 person, if you can kind of make that difference to them, then that's surely just like a ripple effect that's waiting to then start going through the rest of the community.
Yeah, so it's what's the expression? Not all that counts can be counted.
Yeah.
yeah. So my biggest successes have come from my biggest failures, and I've said this to you before. I think if you're not making mistakes, you're probably not doing it right. So when one of the many talks I do is around apologies, and basically how to apologise when you cock up. And one of the ones that stick in my mind is I convinced the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh to let me do a culture change workshop, and they said we want it to be different, and I was like, okay, I can do different. So I don't know if you're aware of the drinking game, Never Have I Ever.
Yep.
So I proposed a workshop based on that, and the college said, well, we're not going to have drinking. Come up with another way, but the same. So it was a culture change workshop called Never Have I Ever that I designed with a colleague. And if you had done it, you put a little sad sticker on your face. And if you were the only person who did it, because at medical school, if you were the only person who drank, you had to stand up and tell a story, right?
Yeah.
So I was like, if you're the only person who's done it, you have to stand up and share with the group. And we worked it out. But it was fundamentally a way of starting uncomfortable conversations while everyone's in a relaxed environment. So one of the ones I had was, never have I ever called someone an inappropriate term of endearment at work, with the full knowledge that someone will put their hand up and be like what? You go, great question. Right, well, let's unpack that a bit, shall we? So, what do we think about mate? Can we call colleagues mate at work? And everyone's going, yes, no, blah, blah. And there was a great debate. What about darling? What about regional variations, right? So, you know, like you go to certain parts of the country and everyone's love or duck, or
Yeah.
right? And then you go to the extremes. Well, what about nicknames? What if I have known one of my female colleagues for years, and at work I just call her sugar tits? Is that okay? Does it matter if there's a patient or not in the room? Is that okay though? I've known her for like 20 years, and everyone's going, oh, I don't know. And I go, what if she says it's okay, but it makes everyone else feel uncomfortable? And it was the point was to have these conversations that people do actually have around flattening the hierarchy and all the rest. And then it got down to where the conversation was always meant to go, which was, what about just first names? Is it inappropriate to call you Tamora at work, right? And we start unpacking this, and then this guy goes, my name is Professor so-and-so, and I have worked for years to earn the title of professor, and you will address me as such. And I was like, okay, fine. I'm a registrar. If I came onto your team, your firm, and I said, hi, my name's Simon, but for the next 6 months, I expect you to call me Mr. Simon Fleming, MRCS. And the MRCS is important because I worked hard for that.
Yeah.
How would you feel about it? And he goes, well, it's ridiculous, it's supercilious, pompous. And I was like,
Yeah.
I know, right? And it was a great conversation about the flattening of the hierarchy and how, if you look at, for example, our colleagues in emergency medicine, a lot of them use first name terms. And then you look for other specialties and it's like Mr. So-and-so, Dr. So-and-so, until your dying day sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I was like, big win. It was a real big success. Lots of very important people with stickers on their faces, like great photo opportunities. And afterwards, a woman came up to me and she said, here's the thing. I was like, yeah. And she was like, you've argued that we should all flatten the hierarchy and go to first name terms. I was like, yeah, I think that's the way. And I think maybe getting rid of the Mr. and Miss bit and just all of us being doctors, I think that's the way. And she was like, I am the first woman in my family to go to medical school. I'm also the first person of colour that my medical school ever had. And how dare you try and take that away from me? And I was like, pardon? And she was like, with what right, with what privilege do you get to say that you're okay being called Simon, so I should be okay being called whatever? Have you ever been mistaken for a cleaning lady? And I was like, no. But she was like, have you ever been mistaken for the nurse after you've said I'm the consultant and I did the surgery? And I was like, no. And she was like, so I worked very hard to be called Miss So-and-so, and I intend on continuing to be called Miss So-and-so. And I will correct people who don't. And I was like, I am really sorry. I need to go away and think about this and do better. And it made me, that interaction, I could have gone away and been like, oh, whatever, sour grapes, angry, all those kind of narratives, right? And instead I was like, yeah, there's more to it than this. I was hoping that there was a really easy, no nuance answer, which is, we should all be on first name terms, job done, problem solved.
Yeah.
And that's not the case. And a lot of the stuff I now do around flattening hierarchy, around titles, around privilege, comes from that interaction, because it's stuck in my head. Because it was I remember stopping myself because I was working up to get defensive. I remember literally, because I was on such a high, because I'd just done this big workshop.
Yeah.
I was ready to be like, one of us has a microphone and one of us is you. And instead I was like, I am really, really sorry. I think I got that wrong. Yeah. And she was like, anything else? I was like, no, I'm sorry. I will do better. And she was like, I hope so. And she walked away. And then I had to go away and do like a bunch of thinking and a bunch of reading and talk to a bunch of people and listen to a bunch more people. And that's still what's playing out now with the whole... So Australia has gotten rid of the Mr. thing. It's all doctor. You're just doctor, right? But there was some pushback, and that narrative is still happening in the UK at the moment, because there are a lot of people who are like, no, this is important, and not because it makes me fancy, and not because people stand up when I walk into a room, but because of what it means and what it symbolises. And a lot of the people who are happy to give these things away have never been mistaken for being a cleaning lady.
Yeah.
And that whole journey that I've been on came from that one little interaction, which was after a conference in a travel lodge somewhere in the north of England. And I've one of my old medical education mentors used to say this whole kind of idea of like, I win or lose. He's like, no, it's more like I win or I learn, which I always really loved.
Nice.
And it's most of my biggest wins have come from relatively impressive cock-ups that I've then forced myself to actually go away and learn from and reflect on.
Do you think that's one of the not dangers, but the kind of... I'm struggling with my words today, but one of the harder things about advocating from a place of privilege, it's that obviously, I've stood here today talking about the relationships between hygiene and therapy students and dental students, and obviously in the kind of, if you look at it from an outside perspective, you can see there's already a hierarchy there. And why are you coming here to talk to us about what our experience might have been? And there's always a danger there. It's kind of, associated with advocating from that kind of position, that sometimes you might just get things wrong.
I mean, it was alluded to earlier when we were introduced, right, that I'm old.
Yeah.
So if I can go full Yoda, right, one of the lessons I learned early on is exactly that. The slippery slope of advocacy is believing your own press and thinking that you can speak for people.
Yeah.
And that's not advocacy. That's some white knight, deluded, whatever. It's about amplifying other voices and sponsoring those voices. So you don't stand up and say, I, Simon Fleming, know what it's like to be a person of colour. What you say is, these are things that are happening to people of colour, and you should speak to them and you should listen to them. And so a lot of the stuff I do is not on camera, on mic, on whatever, it's behind the scenes. So unashamedly, I've been invited to speak at events about what it's like being black. And I'm like, seriously? And they're like, yeah, we've heard you're a great speaker. You speak out against racism. I'm like, yeah, no, but seriously? They're like, yeah. I'm like, okay, cool. Here are 100 people of colour that you need to speak to. And here's a list of names, go. And you're absolutely right. And the fact that you're asking that question of yourself is the greenest of green flags, right? Because it means that you won't stand up and be like, let me tell you what it's like being a dental hygienist at Leeds, right? You wouldn't. What you can say is, these are my lived experiences. And also, you should listen to these people and speak to these people. You wouldn't sit on if Leeds invited you to be on an advisory board to speak on behalf of everyone, you'd go, well, no, I can speak on behalf of these people, but you should speak to these people. And it's that difference between amplifying and sponsoring and empowering and thinking you can speak for people. Yeah. But I made that mistake early, where I was speaking for people, and then afterwards people be like, no, that's a mistake. And you go, I didn't mean to. They asked me a question in the Q&A and I gave an opinion, and it's like, your opinion is fourth hand, right? My friend who's a person of colour told my other friend who told me isn't advocacy. Yeah. And so I've done Q&As where I've unashamedly been like, I'm the wrong person to ask. You need to speak to these people. And I've even done Q&As where I've gone, not only am I the wrong person to ask, but the fact that I'm the only person on this podium tells me you've got more work to do. And I reply to a lot of emails now with like, I won't be on a panel, I won't be on a non-diverse panel. And when conferences and whatever say, we promise it'll be super diverse, and then it's not, I wait till they give me a microphone and I'm like, full disclosure, this is not okay.
Yeah.
And that's a big part of it, is recognizing that once you recognize your own privilege and therefore say, please hold me to account if I cock up, people will. Like people will unashamedly be like, you did the thing, and you're like, cool, thanks for letting me know. I tried not to, but I did the thing.
So, where would you both like to take your culture change work?
Barbados.
Barbados, okay. And we said you were internationally renowned.
Yeah, I know, right?
Not enough, hey?
Solely working on beaches. That was it, wasn't it?
Only places with sandals resorts. I'm not sponsored by sandals. You know what it is? There's where I'd like it for it to go, and then there's potentially where it will go, because again, we spoke about this earlier, the work will never end.
Yeah.
Never, ever, ever. So I will get to retirement and be like, your turn. I guess the problem is it needs to change at multiple levels. And I, as one human being, cannot change all those levels. It's not possible, right? It doesn't matter whether you're PM or a college president or whatever. There's always going to be barriers and other systems in place. What I'd like to see fundamentally is for this to be on everyone's agenda, embedded in everything everyone does, and to have these systems in place, like smoking cessation, like drink driving, right? So it just becomes a thing, right? Every building becomes no smoking, and this is a no smoking thing, and it's okay for everyone to call it out. Every building should have policies around respect and culture of belonging and diversity and inclusion, just so that it just becomes a thing. No one has to think about it. It's just cognitive muscle memory, right? So you walk past a corridor and you hear someone say something, or you see someone do something, and it's perfectly normal and perfectly okay to just be like, sorry, just to remind you, better you, better me. And they go, oh, and I get messages about this. So the first iteration of my campaign was called the Hammer It Out campaign.
Yes.
And I get people message me saying, I was just in the coffee room and I heard someone say, careful or they'll make you hammer it out. And I'm like, did everyone laugh? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, did they stop doing it? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, job done.
Yeah.
And they still do it. And it's become a bit of a throwaway phrase and a joke. But we always intended for it to become that.
Yeah. We want to drill it out.
Right.
Well,
I wanted drill it out for dentists, and I wanted whip it out for urologists, and I wanted all this sort of stuff.
Whip it out.
And everyone was like, but nevertheless, the dream is that the conversations we're having in 30 years' time are not, now that you've solved, the culture in healthcare, what next for you?
Yeah.
But just, what are the current challenges facing healthcare culture? And being like, well, our embedded systems look like this, and this looks like this, and this looks like this. And the classic example is Freedom to Speak Up Guardians, which came out of a lot of the early work. And there are some places where it works really well, and other places where they're part of the problem now.
Okay.
And that's a really good example of where it's a good idea, but it's not quite ready yet. It's not quite done yet. And that's what I'm hoping that in 30 years' time we see, is that this is like smoking cessation, like drink driving. It's just how we roll. which means that when the next problem presents itself, it wasn't that hard for drink driving to also handle drugs and driving, or mobile phones and driving. It was an extension of the same thinking, right?
Yeah.
Smoking cessation, it didn't become that difficult to be like, and vaping also. You're like, okay, and vaping also.
They're already amenable to the culture
Right,
change.
and the systems are just ready to absorb that. Whereas at the moment, when you say stuff like, you need a culture of belonging and you need to treat everyone with respect, everyone's like, what does that mean? And you're like, well, okay, fine. Let's start from the beginning, which is what today was, really.
Yeah.
Is that like, what does that look like for us? Because the flavour of that culture change is different wherever you go. Leeds Dental School is different to Barcelona London, which is different to different to different to different. But the principles around respect and listening and communication and collaboration and inclusivity and belonging, those principles all apply across the board. And it's that I'd like to see embedded in everything, and not in a performative way in some silly poster, but actually just in everything we do, because then it will become part of everything we do. That's the dream.
That's great. Well, I've really enjoyed listening to what inspired you both, and exploring your wins and losses, and whether losses are actually losses or learning. Thank you ever so much for being with us today, and we'll speak again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.